Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. I had always prided myself on my independence. My name is Maggie, and I had lived alone in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town for nearly 2 years. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No roommates, no distractions, just the silence of the evenings and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. The isolation had always been comforting. It was what I needed after a busy week at the marketing firm I worked for. My friends often joked that I'd chosen the apartment for its complete lack of excitement, and they weren't wrong. This weekend, however, I had more solitude than usual. My roommates had gone away for a short trip, leaving me in complete control of the space. At first, I relished the silence. No one to disturb me, no loud chatter, just the soft clicking of my keyboard as I worked from home. The days passed without incident until Friday night. I was getting ready for bed when I noticed it. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move outside my bedroom window. It wasn't like any shadow I'd ever seen. Too tall, too thin, and almost unnatural. I froze, my hand hovering over the light switch. I told myself it was just a trick of the moonlight or the branches of the old oak tree outside swaying in the wind. I had lived in this apartment long enough to know how the light played tricks, especially in the dead of night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. The street was empty, save for the faint glow of the street lamp in the distance. Nothing. I exhaled, relieved, and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily that night. The image of the shadow lingered in my mind, taunting me with its unfamiliarity. Over the next few nights, it happened again. Every time I glanced outside, there was something. A figure, a shadow, never fully visible, but always there, lurking just beyond the glass. I began to question my own sanity. Was I imagining it? Was I overthinking things? I was exhausted, and stress from work had been weighing on me, but I couldn't deny the chill that crept down my spine each time I glanced toward the window. Then the knocks started. At first, they were soft, almost like the sound of a tree branch tapping against the window, but louder. I brushed it off as the wind. But the next night, there was no mistaking it. 3 sharp knocks at 2 a.m. My heart raced. I got up, tiptoeing to the door, half expecting to find a prankster or a drunk neighbor. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. A strange wind? A random coincidence? Yet the knocks continued each night, sometimes at 3 a.m., sometimes at 4:30 a.m., always with that same eerie precision. And no matter how many times I opened the door, I was met with nothing but an empty hallway. It had been almost a week since the first knock, and each night the sounds grew louder, more frequent. It wasn't just the knocks anymore. No, it was something else. Scratching. Faint at first, like a branch scraping against the glass, but then it became more pronounced. Sharp, deliberate, as though something was trying to gain entry. I hadn't dared open the blinds since the first time I peered outside. The shadow of that figure still burned into my memory. The most unnerving part. The sounds didn't stop. They were constant, relentless. The first few times I convinced myself it was just animals or the wind, but now I knew something was wrong. Every time I glanced at the windows, the scratching grew louder, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther across the room, darker and more defined. I tried to ignore it, but the sense of being watched crept over me like an invisible weight, pressing down on my chest. I spent the next day pacing my apartment, inspecting every corner, every window. I triple-checked the locks on all the doors, even though deep down, I knew it wouldn't make any difference. What could I do? I couldn't afford to move, and I wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences drive me out. The knocks and scratches, whatever they were, would stop eventually. They had to. The next evening, after a long day at the office, I tried to relax. I cooked a simple dinner, ate it quickly, and settled down with a book. It was just after 11 p.m. when I first heard it. A soft, methodical knock at the door. Not a chance occurrence. Not the wind. This time it felt deliberate, like someone, or something, was waiting for me to respond. I froze. My pulse raced as I stood in place, staring at the door. It couldn't be. Not again. I waited for the knock to come again, but it didn't. The silence stretched on, suffocating. I told myself it was my nerves getting the better of me. Yet, the moment I moved toward the door, the scratching started up again. sharp, persistent, almost as though it was coming from inside the walls. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 2:30 a.m. My hands shook as I unlocked the security app and opened the live feed. The camera displayed my apartment's darkened interior, just as it should. But then, there it was, on the feed. A figure standing just outside my bedroom window, facing me. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could see his posture. Rigid, almost unnatural, as though he was waiting. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The figure was gone, vanished. I quickly scrolled back, checking the feed from earlier. There was nothing, but I knew what I had seen. I wasn't crazy. Someone had been watching me. The next morning, I couldn't stop shaking. I barely slept, my mind racing with the images from the camera feed. Who was the man outside my window? Why hadn't I seen him before? I wasn't naive. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep pretending it was just my imagination running wild. I needed answers. I decided to check with my neighbors. Maybe someone else had noticed something strange. Maybe I wasn't the only one being watched. I took the stairs down to the first floor, and after a brief hesitation, I knocked on Mrs. Jenkins' door. She was an older woman, someone I rarely saw outside of the occasional wave in the hallway, but I'd always gotten the impression that she was a kind, quiet person. Still, I knew nothing about her really, just the small pleasantries exchanged in passing. When no one answered after several knocks, I assumed she was out. But something about her apartment felt off. The door was slightly ajar, which wasn't like her at all. I hesitated, then pushed it open a bit further, peering inside. The lights were off, but the place looked abandoned. Dust on the furniture, unused. My stomach tightened, and I quickly pulled the door shut. It was probably nothing, just a result of her being away for the weekend like the rest of us. But something about the stillness of the apartment gnawed at me. I bumped into Brad, my next-door neighbor, on my way back to my unit. He gave me a warm smile, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. "Hey Maggie," he said casually. "You notice anything odd lately? Around here, I mean." I felt a jolt of recognition in his question. He had to know. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Brad seemed to hesitate, glancing down the hallway before lowering his voice. "I don't want to freak you out, but, some strange things have been happening in the building. A few people are saying they've heard noises late at night. Scratching sounds, things like that. Even the sounds of someone walking in the halls when no one is around." He paused, clearly looking for my reaction. "Really?" I whispered, my heart rate spiking. "Like what I've been hearing?" Brad nodded, his face suddenly serious. "Yeah, exactly like that. I heard it a couple of times myself." I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, he turned away, as if he had said too much. I watched him walk down the hall, my thoughts racing. Brad wasn't the type to joke about things like this. It was real. The sounds, the knocks, the figure. And now, it seemed like someone else had noticed too. That evening, I decided to investigate more. I set up my security cameras in the hallway, hoping to catch something. Anything. As I sat back on my couch, watching the footage, I felt the creeping sensation again. I wasn't alone. Not just in my apartment, but in the building. I checked the feed, and sure enough, there was the man again, standing just outside my window, as if waiting for me to notice him. His form was clearer this time, his outline more distinct. His hair was disheveled, and his clothes were mismatched, like he hadn't cared about his appearance in a long time. He stared directly into the camera, his eyes wide and unblinking. Then, just as before, he vanished. I couldn't deny it anymore. There was someone out there. Someone watching me, waiting for me to slip up. But who was he? And why did he keep coming back, night after night? I felt like a rat trapped in a maze, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the walls to close in. The following morning, I decided to visit Mrs. Jenkins again. I needed to know if she was okay, if she was even still around. This time, when I knocked on her door, I was prepared for anything, but no one answered. I tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. The apartment was eerily quiet, and there was no sign of life. I pulled out my keys and, against my better judgment, used them to open the door. I had to know. Inside, the apartment was as silent as I remembered. But this time, it felt more like a tomb than a home. The furniture was still in place, but everything felt frozen in time, like Mrs. Jenkins had just stepped out and would return at any moment. But I knew better than to think that was the case. Something was off. The atmosphere in the room was thick, suffocating, like something dark had settled in and refused to leave. As I walked through the apartment, my eyes were drawn to a small photo on the mantel. It was of Mrs. Jenkins, a young woman in her 20s, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. The man had sharp features, his eyes piercing through the photo as though he was looking directly at me. There was something unsettling about the image, like it held a secret that I wasn't supposed to know. I turned away from the photo, my heart racing. The more I tried to make sense of the situation, the less it added up. That's when I saw it. Something that made my blood run cold. Taped to the back of the front door was a letter. The handwriting was shaky, erratic, but the message was clear. She's not who you think she is. She's keeping me from you. I'll make her take me to her. The words sent a chill down my spine. It was addressed to someone, but who? And who was the she in the letter? I felt like I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, one that would explain all of the strange events. I needed to find out more. As I backed away from the door, I heard it again. The knock. The one I had been dreading. The same sharp, deliberate sound that seemed to echo in my head. I rushed to the window and peeked out. There, standing in the dim light of the street lamp, was the figure. It was him again, staring directly at me. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my fingers trembling. I had to do something, anything, to get this man to stop. The knock at my door was followed by another, then another, each one more insistent than the last. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront him, to understand why he was doing this to me. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about me anymore. The police arrived within minutes of my call, but by the time they did, the figure had vanished. There was no trace of him, no signs of forced entry, and no evidence to suggest anything had happened at all. It was as if he had never been there. I watched as the officers inspected the area around my apartment, but their searches were routine, almost mechanical, as if they didn't believe me. "You sure you saw someone, miss?" Officer Ramirez asked, his tone polite but skeptical. "There's no sign of anyone around here. Could have just been a prank." I wanted to scream, to explain that this wasn't some joke or misunderstanding. But I knew it wouldn't do any good. No one could understand. No one had seen what I had seen. The figure, the knocks, the scratching. It was all too real for me. But to everyone else, it was just paranoia. "I'm not crazy," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. "I know what I saw. Please, you have to believe me." Ramirez nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't convinced. "If you say so, miss, just keep the doors locked and try to get some rest, all right?" They left, and I was left in a sea of uncertainty. The silence that followed their departure felt like a suffocating weight, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. I locked every door and window just to be sure, but the fear still gnawed at me. I couldn't escape it. I knew that figure would return. It always did. The night passed slowly, every creak of the apartment building making me jump. I hadn't slept more than a few hours since this all started, but that night, exhaustion finally took its toll. My eyes fluttered shut despite my best efforts to stay awake. Then it happened again. I woke to the sound of the knock. The same sharp, forceful tap that had become a regular part of my nightmare. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest, and glanced at the clock. 3:15 a.m. My stomach twisted into a knot. I had to confront this head-on. I had to know who he was, what he wanted. Enough was enough. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police again, but before I could, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone moving down the hallway. I crept to the door, peering through the peephole. It was him, the figure I had seen on the camera. He was standing just outside my apartment, breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he gripped the doorframe. I stepped back, my heart racing. I had to make a decision. I couldn't hide from this anymore. I had to face him. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, just wide enough to see him. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes wild with fear and desperation. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his hair matted to his forehead. "Please, let me in," he said, his voice strained, almost pleading. "I need to talk to you. I need you to help me." I froze, my mind spinning. Who are you? What do you want from me? The man's gaze flickered toward the floor, his hands fidgeting nervously. I thought you were her. My mother. You look so much like her. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My mind raced. His mother? What was he talking about? The man raised his head slowly, and his eyes locked onto mine with a maddening intensity. You've been keeping her from me, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You're keeping her from me, and I won't let you do that anymore. Before I could respond, a figure appeared behind him. Mrs. Jenkins. But she wasn't the warm, kind woman I'd seen in the photo earlier. No, this woman looked different. Her eyes were vacant, and her face was pale, almost lifeless. The man's eyes flickered to her, and his expression twisted with both joy and anger. There you are, he said, his voice rising in hysteria. You've been hiding from me, but I found you. Now you're going to help me take her home. I stepped back instinctively, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I tried to process the situation. This man, this stranger, was delusional, and worse, he thought I was someone I wasn't. He thought I was his mother. But the woman behind him, Mrs. Jenkins, had been missing for weeks. How could she be standing there, her face a hollow shell of the woman I remembered? I felt like I was slipping into a nightmare. You don't understand, the man said, his voice trembling with a strange mix of relief and fear. She's my mother. I need to take her home. You don't get to keep her from me anymore. I was frozen, my body fighting against the instinct to run. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Mrs. Jenkins, if that was really her, stood motionless behind him, her eyes hollow and glazed over. The man took a slow step toward me, his hand outstretched, fingers trembling. His breath was ragged, his entire body wound tight with an overwhelming urgency. You're going to help me, aren't you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The pleading in his tones sent a wave of unease through my chest. I tried to gather my thoughts, my mind struggling to latch onto any sense of control. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice shaky but firm. You need help. I think you're sick. This isn't real. The man's eyes narrowed, a sharp, disturbing look crossing his face. You don't understand. His voice was suddenly cold, and he stepped closer. I've been waiting for this moment. You were always there, watching me, watching her. Something in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean, I haven't been? My voice trailed off as my eyes flickered to Mrs. Jenkins again. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her face was pale and expressionless, almost like a ghost. A cold realization washed over me. This wasn't just about him wanting his mother. This wasn't just some desperate man trying to reclaim his family. He had been stalking me, watching me, because he thought I was someone else. Someone he needed to take his mother from. And all this time, he had been waiting for an opportunity to force me into playing that role. I stepped back again, my fingers fumbling for my phone, but the man lunged forward, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated. I don't want to hurt you. I just need to get her out of here. You'll help me, won't you? I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, his fingers digging into my skin. Let go of me, I shouted, panic rising in my chest. Suddenly, the door swung open behind me, and 2 police officers stepped into the apartment. Officer Ramirez was the first to react. He shouted at the man to release me, his hand reaching for his weapon. The man, startled, looked over his shoulder, and for a moment I saw a flash of recognition in his eyes, like he knew the game was over. He pulled back from me, his body stiff, his gaze shifting toward the officers. But it was too late. The officers moved quickly, subduing him with practiced precision. I could hear the man's voice, faint but urgent, muttering over and over again, I just need her. I need to take her with me. I staggered backward, my heart still pounding in my chest. The scene unfolded in slow motion as the officers dragged the man away, his eyes wild and searching the room as though he were trying to find someone he had lost. I turned my gaze toward Mrs. Jenkins once more. She was still standing there, her eyes empty. The room felt colder now, the atmosphere dense with the lingering remnants of the man's insanity. Mrs. Jenkins didn't speak, didn't move. The silence in the room was deafening. Ma'am, Officer Ramirez's voice broke through the haze of my thoughts. Are you all right? I didn't answer right away. How could I? The words felt like they were caught in my throat. "I think so," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "But what about her? What happens now?" The officer looked at Mrs. Jenkins, his expression unreadable. "We'll take her to the hospital. She's in shock, but she'll get the care she needs." As the officers escorted the man out of my apartment, I felt the tension slowly leave my body. The immediate danger was over, but the weight of what had happened settled on me like a heavy cloak. The truth hit me harder than I expected. Mrs. Jenkins had been missing for weeks, but in the end, it was her son who had been living in secret, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stood alone in my apartment, my body exhausted from the adrenaline and the fear, but my mind still reeling. The sounds I had heard, the knocks on the door, the figure outside my window. It all made sense now, in a way I wasn't ready to accept. The silence that followed felt louder than anything I had ever experienced. My life, my sense of safety, had been shattered. I'd learned that sometimes solitude isn't as safe as it seems. As the hours passed, the police took Mrs. Jenkins away. I stood at the window, looking out into the dark night. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never look at my apartment the same way again. The end. I never really believed in the paranormal or supernatural. I always thought the stories about people being haunted or possessed were just stories made up for entertainment, or cases of severely mentally ill patients being misunderstood by fanatical priests claiming demonic possession. I never suspected that they were actually real, but when I was 13, my naive brain would be put in its place. It was the summer of 2007. Life was good. I had a pretty normal teenage life. I had a few friends my age who lived in the same neighborhood as me, and we would do a lot of outdoor activities like hiking, mountain biking, and fishing. We lived just north of the Ozark Mountains in a nice little town in Arkansas. My father had worked very hard to give us all a good life. He came from a poor family and joined the military at 18 to better his future, and it paid off. He got a good job working on airplanes, and we moved to the country. My parents got a steal on a really nice old house in the village. It was a nice little community built into the woods, which had golf courses, private lakes and trails, and its own shopping center with a harps and a couple of restaurants. We were a happy, normal middle-class family. That is, until that. Things showed up and ruined our lives. There were a lot of local legends about the natives that used to inhabit the area. Supposedly, our entire community was built on top of sacred land. I used to walk the trails near my house a lot, and you could find cliffs and overhangs with Indian paintings on the walls and remnants of their civilization. I always felt bad about how they were driven from their homes by my ancestors, but I was still grateful for my home and wonderful life. The kids at school would often scare each other by telling tales of shamans summoning skinwalkers and rakes, and that to this day they still haunt the woods at night, looking for a midnight snack. I always laughed it off. Ghosts and monsters aren't real, they're just made-up stories to scare kids. I always thought the ghost hunter shows were ridiculous. You wouldn't hear or see anything on camera, but the people in the show would jump at a creek in the night, and suspenseful music would play while the camera focused on empty darkness. Those shows can be fun for the imagination, but the reality of paranormal entities is much more terrifying. They can tear apart families and bring your whole world crashing down. I would learn this dark reality one summer night. The air was cool. I had my window open and could hear the wind flowing through the leaves. The cicadas reverberating through the midnight woods put me in a sleepy trance. I relaxed and drifted off to sleep. In such a peaceful place, I was completely safe. I always felt one with the woods. It really is beautiful here. Cradled in the sounds of nature, I drifted deep into sleep. Then, a wave of panic. I feel every hair stand up. Chills down my spine. I feel the eyes of someone on me. I can feel their sinister intent. Every fiber in me is telling me to run. There is something here that wants to kill me. No worse. It wants to own me, to see me suffer. It has been watching me. For a long time. I have been chosen. I can't breathe. Help me, I scream. Mom. I hear laughter. Not human, not a physical voice. Multiple voices of all octaves laughing at once. I can't open my eyes, I can't breathe or talk, but I see its eyes. Blue bloodshot bulging eyes. Huge pupils. Red is filling my mind. I feel pressure. My entire body is vibrating, and I feel like I'm going to explode. I gasp as I fully awaken. But as I open my eyes, I freeze. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Through my open door, I can see something laying on our living room couch. It's clearly visible, but clearly not a person. It's like a shadow, but flowing. The moonlight illuminates its face, a skull with a sinister smile. It has those same eyes from my dream. Huge, bulging, wide-open eyes. Crystal blue pupils. It's staring at me, smiling. It's awkwardly sprawled out on the couch, and its shadowy body, like a translucent, but pitch-black cloak, flows as if underwater. I'm getting chills just typing this, and I want to be clear that this is not a fictional story. This really happened. I was so scared I was frozen. I felt electricity going up and down my spine through my brain. My eyes were wide and watering. My mouth hung open. It stared into my eyes, into my mind for what felt like hours. It then quickly shifted out of sight. It darted down the couch and into the shadows. Adrenaline hit me, and I ran into my parents' room. I burst open the door panting and covered in sweat. My parents were at first annoyed, and it was the typical thing parents do when something like this happens. But as I described every detail about my encounter, and when they saw how terrified I was, I started to see a look of unease and fear in my father's eyes. He was scared. He believed me. My father, being a devout Christian, believed in demons, and he was convinced I had just been tormented and that I was in danger. He was very serious, and I could see that he was disturbed by what had just happened. He woke up my little sister, and the whole family gathered in the living room. I wish my dad had never done what he did next. He got out his Bible and turned the pages to a verse. I don't quite remember the actual verse, but it was something about casting out demons. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave my family alone," he yelled angrily, cursing the demon. "If you want one of us, take me. Leave my family alone." We sat in the living room talking well into the night, and after a while we were all tired and went back to bed. I couldn't sleep though. I couldn't forget those eyes, its evil smile, the way it moved. It was disturbing. Fast forward a few months and things were normal. Me and my sister went back to school, and for the most part I had forgotten all about the demon. I even convinced myself it was a bad dream, or even sleep paralysis. Even though that was the only time sleep paralysis had ever happened to me, I went on with my life. Until we got the worst news I had ever heard to this day. My dad was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer, and it had spread. He was dying. We were devastated. I hugged my father and cried all day that day. I couldn't believe I was going to lose my dad. He was always so strong and seemed very healthy. The weird thing is, and the doctors were also puzzled, his cancer was usually only found in teenagers. It was a cancer that almost 100% of the time was only found in boys in their early teens. This shocked me and made me feel guilty. The whole experience of the demon became prominent in my mind, and I remembered my father's words to the demon. I think it had its eye on me, but went after my dad instead. I wish it had taken me though. My family would be much better off today if it had. My father remained positive through his sickness. He went to chemotherapy sessions, started eating healthier, and worked out as much as he could. With his bald head and amputated leg, people would often come up to him and thank him for his service. He always laughed and said thank you because he was a veteran. However, contrary to what people thought, his condition was much worse than if he had stepped on and lied. He lived for 3 more years even though the doctors said he had less than a year to live. He always stayed happy and positive, more for our sake than his own. But toward the end, he started to slowly deteriorate. It was awful. I couldn't do anything to help him. The man I looked up to, who protected us, who I always saw as invincible, was crumbling before me. He lost all his weight and started sleeping on the couch to not disturb my mom. He was so sick. He suffered so much. I would hear his death rattles and moans and want nothing more than to help him in any way I could. Something that disturbs me so much to this day is that I started to realize something. He more and more resembled the demon. He was getting so thin he looked like a skeleton, and he had very blue eyes. Sometimes he would just look at me from the couch and I would get chills. The demon had been mocking me, imitating what he would do to my father while viciously smiling. As if it was funny. This enraged me. How can something be so vile, so purely evil? My poor father soon died and left us a broken family. My mother fell into a deep depression. I looked after my little sister, tried to be the best father figure I could be, even though I was a poor substitute. We fell behind on the bills and the bank foreclosed our house. We lost everything. The next handful of years were a struggle, but now I'm an adult and have gotten some sort of a stable life. I recently figured out why my father was so shaken that night and didn't just blow it off as a bad dream. I visited my sister recently and we started talking about ghosts and the paranormal. I asked if she had ever seen anything like that, and she hesitated for a second, but then told me, and what she said gave me the chills. She was very young the night I saw the demon, and had largely forgotten that night. But she told me she used to see a shadowy man standing at the end of her bed. He had a skull for a face. Demons are real. The house was old. Not the kind of old that seemed to whisper secrets in the walls, but the kind of old that made you think it might collapse if you leaned on it too hard. The kind of house that looked like it had forgotten its purpose, left standing because no one had thought to tear it down. Emily sat on the floor of the living room, her back pressed against the old oak chair that creaked with every shift of her weight. The TV flickered in front of her, casting shadows that seemed too deep for the dim light of the room. The only company she had was the sound of the wind outside, rattling the branches of the trees like skeletal hands. Her parents were away, and they had left her alone with this house for the weekend. She didn't mind, not really. It gave her a chance to catch up on the horror movie marathon she'd been putting off. But something about this house, something she couldn't name, made her feel uneasy. The floorboards creaked in places that didn't make sense, and the windows rattled with the wind, though she could never see a storm on the horizon. It was just a house, or so she tried to tell herself. The first few hours passed without incident. Emily became absorbed in the world of low-budget horror films, the kind with bad acting and predictable plots. But then, just as the clock neared midnight, she began to hear it. A faint scratching noise. At first, she thought it was the house settling, the creaking of old beams and shifting wood. She'd heard that before. But then the sound came again, louder this time, as if something was trying to claw its way through the walls. She paused the movie, sitting up straight. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for the source of the noise. It was so faint she could have imagined it, but there it was again. Scratching, like nails on stone, or something trying to climb inside from the other side. She turned the volume down on the TV, straining to hear. The wind picked up outside, howling in the distance. She brushed it off, chalking it up to the old house playing tricks on her. Minutes passed, but the noise didn't stop. It was steady now, rhythmic, almost deliberate. Emily's heart began to race, her fingers clutching the armrests of the chair. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something alive. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and moved to the wall nearest to the noise. Her breath came out in shallow bursts as she pressed her ear to the cold plaster. She could hear it clearly now. Scratching, dragging, something large moving inside the walls. She stepped back, a chill creeping down her spine. Just the house, she muttered to herself, but the words felt hollow. She didn't believe it. She couldn't. There was something else in here, something far worse than old beams and creaky floorboards. The night dragged on, thick and suffocating. Emily tried to return to the couch, but the scratching continued relentless. It gnawed at her nerves, every faint scrape against the plaster turning her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was getting closer, the sounds echoing in her ears as though whatever was making them was no longer confined to the walls. She tried to ignore it, tried to lose herself in the dim glow of the TV screen, but her mind kept drifting back to the noise. Minutes became hours, the weight of the silence pressing down on her chest. She glanced at the clock. 2:30 a.m. The scratching hadn't stopped. It had only grown louder, sharper. Something was definitely moving in there. Emily's breath hitched in her throat as she stood again, this time with more purpose. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the beam harsh against the darkness of the house. She moved slowly, her footfalls cautious on the creaky wood floor, her eyes scanning every shadow. The scratching was constant now, like something dragging its claws against the surface of the walls. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling. It was something else, something alive. She felt her pulse quicken. In the far corner of the living room, where the floor met the wall, Emily noticed something strange. A set of deep scratch marks marred the foundation of the house, gouged into the wood. They looked recent, fresh even, and they were far too large to have been made by any small animal. She bent closer, shining the flashlight down at them. the beam quivering as her hand shook. She could see remnants of fur caught in the cracks, matted and torn. The hairs prickled at the back of her neck. The noise grew louder, more insistent. The claws scraping against the plaster were now punctuated by the occasional thump, like something heavy shifting inside the walls. Emily backed away, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind raced, desperate for an explanation. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to think. Her gaze darted back to the wall, to the marks that now seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The scratching had stopped for a moment, but the silence was somehow worse. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, she heard a noise that made her blood run cold. A slow, rasping breath, as if something was waiting just behind the plaster, inhaling, exhaling. Emily's eyes widened. She wasn't alone. There was something in the house with her. Something that had been here long before she ever set foot in this place. Emily stood frozen, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The sound, soft, almost imperceptible, was still there, a steady rhythm of breathing from within the walls. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat thundering in her ears as she struggled to make sense of it. She wanted to scream, wanted to call out, but the air in her lungs had been stolen by fear. She was alone, and whatever was in this house with her was not. She stepped back slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck prickle, as though something was watching her. The scratching returned, sharper and more urgent this time, as if the creature was testing the walls, gauging its next move. Emily's mind raced, images of horrific creatures from the horror movies she loved so much flashing through her thoughts. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. The walls seemed to groan under the strain of whatever was moving inside them. Emily swallowed hard, fighting the nausea rising in her throat. She had to do something. Anything. She couldn't just stand there and wait for whatever it was to come for her. But what? How? She wasn't a survival expert. She had no idea how to deal with something like this. Her eyes flicked toward the door, then to the windows, but it was no use. She was trapped in the house. She had no choice but to confront whatever was in the walls. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the heavy old fire poker from the fireplace. It was the only weapon she had. She moved cautiously toward the center of the room, her every step weighed down by the growing sense of dread that thickened the air around her. The breathing stopped abruptly. Silence. The hairs on her arms stood on end. Her grip tightened around the poker, her knuckles white. And then, there it was again. A thump. Soft at first, then louder, like something large shifting behind the walls. Emily froze. She turned slowly, the flashlight beam darting toward the corner where the scratch marks had been. The thumping grew louder still, and then the unmistakable sound of claws dragging across wood echoed through the room. And then she saw it. A dark shape, slithering just behind the thin layer of plaster. Its outline shifted, indistinct but unmistakably large. The creature, whatever it was moving toward her. She could hear it now. Its breathing, the scraping of its body as it squeezed through the narrow spaces between the walls. She stumbled backward, heart racing, unable to tear her eyes away. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was real. It was here. Emily's body was frozen. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a drum in the silence between the thumping noises echoing in the walls. The flashlight wavered in her trembling hands as she watched the dark outline slither through the plaster, scraping and clawing at the foundation as though it was trying to force its way into the room. The air felt heavy, thick with the stench of something rotten, something ancient. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, to break the silence and make noise that would shatter the terror consuming her. But she couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the floor as her mind screamed at her to act. Do something, Emily. Anything. The poker in her hand felt too light, too insignificant against whatever was lurking behind the walls. The creature's shape grew clearer, a dark mass shifting beneath the plaster. Emily's throat was dry, her breath shallow as she tried to will herself to move. The scratching noise grew louder again, a frantic tearing of claws that shook the walls, vibrating through her bones. She wasn't going to wait for it to break through. She couldn't. There was no way out, no way to escape. She would have to face whatever it was, and hope she had enough time before it found her. With a quick motion, she swung the poker at the wall, the sharp metal striking the plaster with a heavy thud. The creature stopped moving. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Emily's chest rose and fell rapidly, her breath caught in her throat as she waited for the next move. The sound of claws scratching again broke the silence. But this time it was different. It was closer. Much closer. The creature was no longer behind the walls. It was in them, moving directly beneath her feet. Emily took a shaky step backward, her eyes darting to the front door. But she couldn't bring herself to run. There was nowhere to go. She had to stay and fight. She swung the poker again, striking the wall with all her strength. The plaster cracked, the sound reverberating through the house. A violent thump echoed from inside the wall, and then, suddenly, a mass of claws and teeth burst through the plaster with a deafening crash. It was monstrous. It was long, its limbs grotesquely twisted, with patches of dark, matted fur clinging to its pale, elongated skin. Its eyes, gleaming in the dim light, were full of hunger. It let out a sharp hiss, and before she could react, it lunged toward her, its claws slashing through the air. Emily screamed, bringing the poker down with all her might, striking the creature's arm just as it was about to reach her. It screeched in pain, the sound high and shrill, echoing through the room. But it didn't retreat. It only came at her harder, faster. She dodged to the side, barely avoiding the creature's deadly claws as they slashed past her, cutting the air with unnatural speed. There was no time to think. Emily swung the poker again, aiming for its head. The creature recoiled, its hissing growing louder. She swung again, and this time the poker connected with a sickening crack. The creature shrieked, but it wasn't enough. It was still coming. It was still too strong. Desperation took over. Emily glanced around the room for anything else to use, anything to help her survive. Emily's heart raced, her breath ragged as the creature moved in on her once again. The poker was barely enough to slow it down, let alone stop it. She had no more time to swing, no more time to think. The walls were closing in, and the creature was relentless. Its eyes gleaming with hunger, its claws slashing at the air, leaving deep gouges in the floorboards. She couldn't fight it head-on, not like this. She needed a plan. Her eyes darted around the room, frantic, searching for anything that could give her an edge. She couldn't take her eyes off the creature, but she couldn't let it get any closer either. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the scent of decay clung to everything. Then she saw it. An old wooden chair, its back broken and warped with age. It was sturdy, heavy, and it had sharp legs. Perfect. She grabbed the chair and flung it across the room, watching it crash into the far wall with a loud bang. The creature jerked, its head snapping toward the noise, and for a moment it hesitated. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. This was her chance. Quickly, she moved to the corner of the room and pulled the fire poker free from the floor. She dragged it along the floor toward the small door leading to the basement. It was the only place in the house with a trapdoor, one that she had never bothered to open before. She didn't want to think about what might be down there, but right now it was the only option she had. The creature seemed to sense her intentions. It snarled and lunged, its claws raking the floor, its eyes locked on her. Emily threw the poker down with a loud crash to divert its attention. Then she slammed the basement door shut behind her, locking it in place. For a few moments, there was nothing. The creature's hissing was muffled, but she could hear it. Scratching, scraping, clawing at the door. Emily's pulse was a constant hammer against her skull. The walls felt like they were closing in. The house groaned under the pressure, as though it too was aware of the danger that lurked within it. Then the scratching stopped. Emily didn't move, didn't even breathe. She could feel her hands shaking. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her mind raced, but there was nothing. Not a sound. No movement. Just the oppressive silence that filled the house. Her eyes remained locked on the basement door, her heart in her throat. Then, suddenly, the door shuddered violently. It rattled in its frame, the sound of wood splintering filling the air. Emily stumbled backward, her back pressing against the far wall. The creature was relentless. She knew it wouldn't be long before it broke through. I have to do something. Her mind flashed back to the old survival manuals her father had left lying around the house. Books filled with practical advice on trapping, creating makeshift weapons, and surviving in dangerous situations. She recalled a trick she'd seen. Using a set of string, an old box, and a weighted object to create a snare. She scrambled to the basement shelves, grabbing whatever she could. She had no time to second-guess herself. The creature's claws scraped against the door again, this time harder, faster. Emily set to work, creating the trap she needed. She could hear the thing breathing heavily on the other side. Come on. Her fingers moved quickly, her body trembling with the effort. until at last she was ready. The creature crashed into the door with all its force, but the trap was set. Emily rushed to the far side of the room, positioning herself where she could see it through the basement window. She held her breath, waiting for it to make its final move. The house seemed to hold its breath. The scraping and clawing had subsided for the moment, but the tension in the air was unbearable. Emily pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the basement, her hand still gripping the makeshift trap. She didn't dare let go, didn't dare move too much in case the slightest sound alerted the creature to her position. Every second felt like an eternity, each heartbeat a loud echo in her ears. Then, as if to mock her anxious silence, the door to the basement rattled again. The creature was back, its furious attempts to break through now accompanied by a growl. Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her focus, praying the trap would work. The creature slammed into the door with all its might. She could hear the wood splintering under its assault. Emily's fingers tightened around the rope and box mechanism she had rigged up. The door groaned, its hinges creaking, but it held. For a moment, she thought it might actually be enough to stop the beast from getting through. Then, with a final, powerful crash, the door splintered. Emily's breath caught as the creature lunged into the room, its dark form crashing into the trap she'd set. The rope snapped taut and the box, the heavy weight she'd attached to the trigger, fell. The creature let out a high-pitched screech of frustration as it was caught in the snare. Its limbs flailed, thrashing violently against the ropes, but the trap held strong, tightening around it as the weight of the box swung into place, forcing it to the ground. For a moment, the creature was still. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. She couldn't believe it. She had actually caught it. But that wasn't enough. It wasn't over yet. She had to make sure it stayed trapped. Through the dim light of the basement window, she saw its eyes glowing in the shadows, watching her. Its chest rose and fell with each ragged breath, and for a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. Emily's hand tightened around the poker she still held in her other hand. She could feel the sweat on her palms. She had to finish this. She grabbed the rope and tied it off quickly, securing the creature in place as tightly as she could. Every inch of her body screamed to run, to flee from the nightmare she had trapped, but she forced herself to stay. She needed to be sure. Outside, she could hear the sound of a truck pulling up to the driveway. Slow, steady. Relief flooded through her. Sheriff Wallace. Emily had managed to call for help just before the creature had broken through the basement door. The sheriff had arrived just in time. A moment later, the door to the basement creaked open. The sheriff's silhouette stood in the doorway, the harsh beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. Emily couldn't help but let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "What the hell is that thing?" Sheriff Wallace asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and awe as he stepped into the basement, his flashlight trained on the creature. "It's a crawler," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. She barely recognized it as her own. "It's been in the walls of my house for weeks. I don't know what it is, but it's alive." Wallace didn't respond right away. He simply took a long step toward the creature, crouching low to examine it. He kept his distance, and for good reason. The thing was still writhing in its makeshift cage, growling and snapping its teeth. "I've heard of things like this," Wallace said after a long moment. "Cryptids, things that don't belong in the world we know. Never thought I'd see one for myself, though." He shook his head, muttering to himself as he reached for his radio. "I'm going to get the feds down here. This is way beyond local law enforcement." Emily didn't respond. She simply watched the creature as it struggled against its restraints, its eyes still locked onto her. She felt a mixture of dread and relief settle over her. She had survived. Barely. But it wasn't over. They had captured the thing, but there was no telling how many others like it might still be out there, hiding in the shadows. As the sheriff called for backup, Emily took one last look at the creature, now subdued, but still very much alive. It hissed softly, its eyes never leaving hers. I want to start off by saying that everything I've written down here is true. None of it was made up. I'm not a scary story writer or anything. I just need to share this experience with someone, and I'm afraid of how the people around me would react. Me and my girlfriend like to use recreational drugs sometimes. They're called research chemicals. On Friday, July 29th, 2022, we used some uppers. The ones we use give you a rush in energy, but have no psychedelic or hallucination-inducing effects. Had a great time and slept it off the next day, both of us waking up late in the afternoon. We had a good breakfast and Netflix and chilled for a while. She lives in a studio apartment and has pet rats, so we can't smoke inside because they have sensitive lungs. The building she lives in has a public balcony, so that's where we went out to smoke about every hour or so. It was a small balcony on the second floor, with wood railings and a stone floor overlooking the neighborhood. The building's rule was that nobody was allowed on the balcony after 10 p.m. We didn't really give a something about that rule, and neither did anybody else, so we'd smoke there in the evenings too. It was on Saturday night, July 30th, that we went for a smoke outside again. Must have been midnight. We were reminiscing about the day before. About halfway through our cigarettes, I suddenly heard a weird noise very far in the background. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and since we were having a conversation, I tried to ignore it. It stopped after a couple of seconds. I noticed it stopped but paid no mind. When our cigarettes were done, we were still just standing on the balcony talking when I suddenly heard the sound again, and immediately asked my girlfriend to be quiet. "Why?" she asked. I responded with SHH. I was listening to what that sound was, and as it was now quiet, I was able to hear it more clearly. After a few seconds, I realized what I was hearing, and I felt a cold chill running down my spine like my soul got sucked down through the floor. My whole face went pale. "I hear a woman screaming," I said. She laughed at first and jokingly asked if I was high on something. I told her to shut up for a second and really listen. She noticed how dead serious I was, and she turned her ear towards the end of the balcony, and as she heard it, I saw her face turn just as pale. "That's a woman screaming," she said. Our first thoughts were that somehow we had taken some really bad drugs and had some kind of weird shared psychosis after effect. We immediately checked if we had any symptoms of overdosing or after effects. No sweats, no high heart rate, no fatigue, no crazy thoughts. Both of us were able to think and talk clearly. We concluded that the sound we were hearing, a woman screaming, was real. The reason this struck us so was because it wasn't a normal kind of scream. It wasn't somebody getting scared or mugged or whatever. This scream was different. It echoed. It carried a hopelessness in its tone. It sounded so vague and far away, like it was carried to us by the winds. The scream sounded like somebody screamed their soul out of their body and into the sky. Both of us nailed to the floor, we kept listening in silence. Some loud-ass teenagers were cycling home, probably from a bar or something, and screaming at each other. Both of us could finally breathe again. Well, that was the logical conclusion. Just some loud teenagers, she said. I initially agreed, but when they were far beyond what we could hear, the screams came back again. Their sound even more desperate now. I did not hesitate and immediately called emergency services. I explained to them what we had heard and how it had affected us. They told us they're sending a police car over. We were outside in the parking lot near the main entrance, waiting for them. Still hearing these faraway screams. The police arrived at 1:45. 2 officers, a male officer and a female officer, introduced themselves and asked us to explain in detail what we experienced. So we told them exactly what we heard and where we heard it from. The male officer didn't take it too seriously and tried to ease out of it by saying it was probably just mating frogs. Apparently, they make a scream-like sound when mating. The female officer took us more serious and stood with us listening. And very faintly, like whoever was screaming was running out of energy and time, we heard her again. So did the female officer. She immediately contacted the station, and they set out a search and rescue. We were thanked for reporting this, and they left. For me, it wasn't done yet, though. We sat back down on the balcony and kept listening. As we were sitting there, the night sky turned a pulsating blue from all the police cars driving around trying to find this screaming woman. We sat there just listening to the continued screaming, hoping it would stop when they found her. Must have been about 20 minutes later, almost 1:30, that the screams finally stopped. My hopes were that the police had found her and she was safe, but deep down I had a feeling that she wasn't. That Wednesday I was at my mother's house for dinner. She lives in the same town as me. During dinner I told her what we had experienced and how frightening it all was. My mother stood up without saying a word, walked over to the living room, grabbed that day's paper and handed it over to me. Woman found dead under fallen tree. The headline read, I was shocked. I felt my eyes filling up with tears and said with a shaky voice, "I heard this woman die." Against my better judgment, I kept reading. The 47-year-old woman was on a midnight walk in the woods last Saturday night when a tree fell over and crushed her legs. Local authorities believe the woman may have survived for several hours before succumbing to her injuries. She had been dead for almost 72 hours before she was found. The police refused to share further details as to her identity or passing. There was more in the article, but I could not and refused to read it through my tears. I did not have it in me to share this with my girlfriend out of fear of how she would take it. But that's not the most disturbing part of all this. I live alone, and sometimes when I'm in bed and can't sleep at midnight, I can still hear her screaming. Sometimes my doorbell rings in the middle of the night, but when I go to check, there's never anybody there. I had a camera doorbell installed, and the only thing I caught on camera was the sound of my doorbell ringing. Sometimes I hear a weird knocking sound like somebody is banging on wood. Stuff in my house seems to relocate on itself, such as clothing, food, and tools. My fridge door sometimes opens by itself. Whenever I look at my kitchen door, it feels like something is watching me. My cat Robin seems to stare at nothing in corners, and sometimes even gets a big tail, starts hissing at these empty corners. Ever since all that happened, my TV has this weird thing where it turns itself back on after I turn it off. It's only when I take the plug out of the socket that it stays off. All these things seem to only happen between midnight and 1:30. The most horrible thing is I can hear her screaming when it's silent around me. I called my doctor about this because I thought I was going insane. She referred me to a team of therapists. After countless hours of talks and sessions, they confirmed that I suffer from no form of delusion, hallucinations, psychosis, or any other mental illness that could cause me to experience all this. But I still do. She still screams at me. Last night, January 2nd, 2023, I heard her screaming and banging again. When I went to bed and shut the lights off, I kept having this feeling like someone was standing next to my bed watching me. And so I decided today, January 3rd, that I should write down this experience and share it in hopes that she may find some rest in the knowledge that she won't be forgotten. Since we never got a name, I simply call her the Screaming Woman. May she rest in peace. I'm not even sure where to begin. The women in my family, including myself, have had this sixth sense for as long as I can remember. We've had dreams and visions that have come true, as well as a few personal encounters with what we now believe to be spirits or some kind of evil energy. Yes, we are all spiritual people, but no matter how many times these things happen, we still can't get a grasp on why or how these things continue to be so drawn to us. So, what I'm about to tell you, as crazy as it may seem, is a completely true story. Other than my immediate family, no one else knows. I don't talk about this ever. I don't enjoy having to relive what happened. But I'm hoping this will help others who share this spiritual gift. So, here goes. To set the scene, I live in a very rural place, in a small town that has maybe a few thousand residents. But we're all so spaced out and hidden in the hills, you'd never know that many people live here, unless there was a 4th of July carnival or some kind of festival. My town isn't anything fancy. We don't have the most up-to-date stores and all that, but for the most part, we're all happy and thankful for what we do have. The neighborhoods were like mini communities. We all cared and helped one another. Everyone was friends with everyone, and we all knew each other's business. It was the middle of spring. Lovely weather in the mornings and nights, but as the day went on, you could feel the heat steadily rise. As the heat rose, families came outside to bask in the bright sunlight, while young kids laughed and played. This spring day was just like any other day. I got up, got ready for school, and left to go listen to mundane lectures for the next 8 hours. I'll never forget that feeling I had while I sat and daydreamed, wishing time would go faster just for the school day. That little glimmer of hope would trickle up into my brain when the clock finally read 3 p.m. It's time to go home. Oh, thank God, I thought to myself as the 3 p.m. bell rattled my ears. I rush home as always, even though I know the only thing that I'm rushing towards is a mountain of homework. It's like my mind plays tricks on me, making me think that simply being out of school and at home is a relaxing reward for getting through the day, although there wasn't any actual relaxing. It was just more stress in a comfortable environment. I hustle through the multiple pages, completing every problem with a bit of skepticism, questioning my intelligence. But nonetheless, I talk myself up and get through it. Before I know it, the clock reads 8 p.m. Time to eat and shower, and then I can rest for the first time today. I complete these remaining 2 tasks and gleefully skip to my bedroom. I slip on whatever large t-shirt I can find and jump into my large pink bed, letting the comfort of my soft pillows and furry covers overtake me as I slowly sink into the mattress. I'm one of those people that are woken up very easily. I'm not kidding, a mouse could fart and it'd wake me up. So when I felt my eyelids trying to shut, I took full advantage. I tuck myself in, get comfortable, and go straight to sleep. Now, these next events are questionable, to say the least. I still, to this day, have no idea why God showed me what he did. I've even questioned if it was God that showed me this, or if this was the work of the devil. The very second my eyelids shut, I'm no longer asleep in my cozy bed. I'm in the passenger seat of a small black truck, an S10. A truck that I've never even seen in person, let alone been in before. And I'm hot. I'm so hot. I instantly feel gobs of sweat pour down my face and chest. My once comfortable t-shirt is already drenched in heavy sweat, clinging to my body. It's like my physical body had been here much longer than my mind was aware of. The heat instantly sends my mind into a frenzy. Intrusive thoughts race through every crevice of my brain as my breath becomes shallow, as if my lungs were incapable of inhaling the boiling air. I frantically look around the black interior of the truck, trying to find the door handle to get out, but there isn't one. That's when I notice that not only am I in the passenger seat, but the truck is moving. I glance over to the driver's seat to see a large, black, blurry figure that looks like the outline of a person. It's like these black pixels that are constantly moving, yet making sure to keep the outline visible, and it is driving this truck. I couldn't focus on anything more than the entity itself at this point. The dark particles erratically swirled all through this outline of a person, imitating normal human movements as one would do when driving. I could see the black pixels wrap around the steering wheel, as the wheel would move whatever direction the entity willed it to. Complete dread coats every limb of my body as I try to focus on these particles, but I just couldn't. No matter how hard I tried, this thing remained so blurry. All I could see was the scattered outline of a person that was a little bigger than me. As I stare at the outline with intense bewilderment, I'm met with sudden feelings of nostalgia and grief, but I no longer feel fear, at least not for the entity. Before I can even question why I'm experiencing these emotions, they were viciously ripped away in a matter of milliseconds. My mind is yet again forced to focus on the overwhelming heat that was continuing to seep through the black truck. I can feel the gallons of sweat that have combined with the fabric seat, gushing as I move my burning body. The heat is so intense, I'm barely able to hold my head up to look out of the scorched windows. We're in the old hollow that I grew up in as a child. The same little red house my neighbor and I played at daily. The same tire swing my cousin and I spent many evenings on. The same blacktop road that was eaten away with more potholes than you can count. It was all there, all the things I grew to love and cherish. But everything was on fire. The trees were glowing bright yellow, so bright it was like you could sense the vibration of the intense flames just by looking at them. The grass was swaying with vibrant colors of yellow and orange as the fire consumed every inch of this world. The sky was overtaken by huge, dark clouds of black smoke that never seemed to let up. The road was even engulfed in these extraordinary flames like we were magically driving on molten lava, yet I could still feel every pothole the truck drove over. Tears fill my eyes, and just for a moment, I forget that my body feels like it's in the middle of being cremated. But then I hear the screams that were coming from the fire. These high-pitched screams were cries of agony and despair. You don't ever forget screams like this. Screams that make your blood curdle and your stomach turn. Screams that are so prominent, it's like you can feel their pain. My body tightens uncontrollably, and I'm met with an immense feeling of sorrow. I can no longer talk or move, I'm frozen in place. I'm forced to witness the best memories of my childhood and the people I love, burned to ash in this world made of fire. The black figure continues to drive us further into my old hollow that is now immersed in blazing flames and cries of torment, as I'm melted to the seat, unable to move or scream. This continues for what seems like forever. How do I get out? Get me out. These were the only thoughts I could muster. The black figure suddenly turns to me, as if recognizing my presence for the first time, and I'm jolted awake. I wake up, drenched in sweat, as if I had just come out of a sauna. Considering the AC was set to 68 degrees, and I had my fan on, per usual, I knew the sweat had to be from the flames of my dream. I start hysterically crying and run straight to my mother's bedroom. Now, keep in mind, I'm a teenager. Running to my mother's bedroom because of a bad dream is something I haven't done since I was a very young child. I frantically wake her up and try to relive this nightmare I narrowly escaped, just long enough to explain why I was so utterly terrified. As I open my mouth, my words seem to melt together, as if I were babbling like a baby, not making any sense. Without full comprehension of why her daughter was crying uncontrollably, Mom instantly wrapped her loving arms around me and started praying in that same sweet tone she used when I got hurt as a small child. After a few minutes of consoling, I realize that I'm safe now, and that brings just enough comfort so I can force back my tears and random babbling. Thinking that the unnerving night was nearing its end was a soothing feeling that allowed me to drift back off to sleep in my mother's arms. However, that relief was short-lived. Fast forward to 2 days later. Again, normal day to me. At least on this day, I have a hair appointment to look forward to. It feels nice to have a tiny bit of excitement for more than just going home after school. Besides, this is a positive distraction from the nightmare that tormented me just 2 nights ago. It was just a bad dream, you're okay now. I tell myself, ignoring the obvious denial I'm in. I get to the salon, which so happens to be owned by my cousin, Laura, like I said, small town. I happily strut in the salon and sit down, smiling ear to ear, simply happy to have a minuscule change of scenery. Laura and I start off with the normal, nice formalities. How are you? How's your day been? Etc. Silence freshens the air for all of 3 seconds before she sighs and says, "Did you hear about Ben?" Ben is our cousin as well. I grew up with him and his sister when I was a child. Back then, our whole neighborhood was very well connected and close. We all cared for one another, and we acted like one big, happy family. I hadn't seen Ben in many years, though. We moved out of that neighborhood when I was in the 5th grade, and Ben and I lost touch. As soon as Laura said Ben, my mind was flooded with memories of my childhood. The days that seemed to go by in a flash, climbing hills, swinging on tire swings, wading through the creek. My body felt warm as nostalgia filled my every thought. I did everything I could to push back what I had seen just 2 nights ago, my childhood in those energetic flames. But that nostalgia was quickly interrupted when Laura hands me photos of what looked to be a blackest 10 truck. The truck looked like bent-up chunks of metal scattered across the scuffed-up pavement. As badly as the truck was torn apart, I already knew there was no way possible for anyone to survive that. It was nothing more than scraps, surrounded by broken glass and blood. But as I continue to stare at the photos with immense disbelief, I can't shake the feeling that I know this truck. I know that black interior, I know the entire inside of this vehicle, yet I know I never actually rode in a black 10. The nightmare, I thought as my eyes widened and my breath shortened. That is how I know this truck. This was the truck that black figure trapped me in while we drove through hellfire. I had no idea that Ben had a black 10. Again, I hadn't talked to him in years. Turns out, Ben had been out partying for his 21st birthday. He had also been drinking alcohol. I mean, who wouldn't drink on their 21st birthday? The mistake he made was driving home after he was drinking. He wrecked and passed away in the same hollow that black entity drove me through. The same hollow where all of our childhood memories were made. The same hollow that was eaten by flames 2 nights ago. The very night I was forced to witness this nightmare. Is the same night Ben passed away. After years of racking my brain, the only plausible explanation I can come up with is that this was some sort of message, although I'm still not sure what that message was. I believe the outline of a person that was driving us was Ben, the last spot in my childhood hollow that I had seen before I was startled awake. Was the place where Ben had died. It's almost like I was in the truck with him when he was driving that night. I was vigorously flung back to reality once he wrecked and died. Maybe that's why he couldn't sense my presence until the very end. I just don't understand it, and I'm not sure I ever will. I still have so many questions. Questions that eat away at my soul, deepening the voids that the mysterious flames coercively tore open. Should I have focused harder on my nightmare? Why was I the one that experienced this? Why me? What should I have done differently? And the question that still fills my very soul with peril. Could I have saved his life? To celebrate our anniversary, my wife and I booked an Airbnb for the weekend, a cabin on the lake. Looks like it's about to rain, Amber said as she rolled her suitcase across the porch. I looked up. To the west, the sky was deep gray, thick storm clouds heading towards us at a steady pace. Just our luck, I grumbled, hauling my suitcase out of the trunk. After we'd gotten everything inside, we poured wine and sat by the picture window overlooking the lake. The sky was darker now, and the glassy stillness of the water reflected the deep gray of the sky. The pine trees surrounding the lake swayed in the wind. "Wait, look," Amber said. "There's someone out there." At first I didn't see what she was talking about. But then, as I squinted, I did. In the middle of the lake, there was a tiny, peach-colored blob bobbing up and down. Someone was out there, and they were waving their arms around as if signaling for help. "Oh God, are they drowning?" Amber asked, rushing over to the window. You call the police," I said, getting up and grabbing my jacket. "I'll take the rowboat out and try to help." The Airbnb had advertised a small rowboat that we could use. I could be out in the middle of the lake in under 5 minutes. Given how far we were out from town, it would probably take the police 20 minutes to get here. Amber looked at me as if she were about to say something, but then she just nodded. I zipped up my coat and ran outside. The rain had started. A light drizzle blurred the lake in front of me, wetting my face. I ran down to the docks and undid the knot, then stepped into the boat. It rocked violently underneath me as I sat down and pushed off with the oars. I rowed furiously towards the center of the lake, keeping my eyes on the person. But they were a lot farther out than I had anticipated. Even after rowing 5 minutes, my arm muscles burning, I was only slightly closer. I stopped for a second and cupped my hands around my mouth. "Hey, I'm coming to help. Hang in there." They didn't respond, just kept waving their arms over their head. Probably can't hear me, I thought. Sucking in a deep breath, I began to row faster. The rain was harder now. Thick raindrops hit the wood of my boat with a tap, tap, tap. Water dripped down from my hair and into my eyes. I shook my head to get it off, not breaking stroke, and continued rowing towards the center of the lake. The person was finally a little closer now. I could see them bobbing up and down on the surface of the lake through the pelting rain, waving their arms furiously above their head. It looked like it was possibly a woman with dark hair, but I couldn't be certain. The oars sloshed through the lake. I was panting and my arms ached, but I forced myself to continue forward. They weren't that far off now. In just a few minutes, I'd probably be close enough to yell out to them, to see them clearly. Flash. The sky flashed white. Seconds later, the rumble of thunder, so loud I could feel it in my bones. I swallowed. This isn't safe. I glanced back at the cabin. It was so far away now. I could see the tiny brown blob that was Amber, standing on the docks, waiting for me to return. Maybe we should have just waited for the police. What if I get struck by lightning? I swallowed and turned back to the woman. Paddled as fast as I could with all my might. The rain pelted down furiously, running down my face, pooling in the bottom of the boat. The peach-colored blob grew closer and closer, and then I could see her clearly for the first time. Every muscle in my body froze. Because as she bobbed on the water, waving her hands above her head, she was smiling. Not just smiling. Grinning from ear to ear as she stared at my boat approaching. Instinctively, I grabbed the oars and backpedaled. The water resisted me, kicking up in loud splashes, and then the boat began to slide away from her. Re-eyeing, I grabbed the cell phone out of my pocket. It was Amber. "Drew," she breathed, her voice wavering on the other end of the line. "The police," they said. "Whatever you do, don't go out into the lake." What? Some psycho has been swimming out into the middle of the lake, luring people out. Just leave her there. Come back. She continued talking, but I didn't hear what she said, because the woman had disappeared. The phone fell out of my hands. I grabbed the oars and pulled them towards me, rowing backwards towards the shore as fast as I possibly could. I stared into the water, looking for a ripple, a shadow, anything, but it was impossible. With the rain hitting the surface, the reflections of the storm clouds, there was no way I could tell where she was. I rowed faster, my heart pounding in my chest. Glancing over my shoulder, I could see that the dock was still so far away. Amber began waving to me frantically. Flash. The sky, the lake, the pine trees at the shore lit up. A peal of thunder rang in my ears. I rowed faster, and then I heard it. A tap, tap, tap from the bottom of my boat. I didn't have time to react before the boat flipped over and I plunged into the ice-cold water. I broke the surface and gasped in air, screaming as I grabbed the side of the boat. Something grabbed my ankle and tugged. I plunged back into the water. I struggled to pull myself up, but the iron grip on my ankle wouldn't loosen. I kicked and thrashed, trying to pull myself up towards the shadow of the boat above me, and then the grip released. I broke the surface, gasping. Then I clawed at the boat, desperately righting it. After a few attempts, I was finally able to get myself back inside. I turned it around and rowed as fast as I possibly could, never looking back. Miraculously, the woman didn't follow me. I scrambled up on the dock and Amber hugged me, crying. The police arrived soon after and searched the lake for the woman, but they came up empty-handed. Needless to say, Amber and I cut our trip short. We packed our bags and started the drive home just after the sun had set. But as we pulled out of the driveway in the darkness, I swear I saw a light winking at us from the middle of the lake, as if someone was trapped out there, signaling for help. Farm in eastern Maine near Acadia. We stayed in the basement apartment built into side of hill, so it was full of light and not creepy looking at all. No locks on the front door, which was weird for a city girl. We unloaded the car and was settling in when we noticed a door with a mirror at the end of the hallway between the bathroom and bedroom, though it was just a mirror. We opened it to find a root cellar that was clearly in use, and another door leading to the outside. No locks on any of these doors, and then turned around to see that the mirror is actually a one-way mirror that looked down the hallway and into the kitchen. We about noped out of there right then, but it was late and we didn't know where to go. So we set up a very elaborate system of luggage and chairs to block the mirrored door and the front door. Slept poorly, but all was fine in the end. Haven't booked a place on Airbnb since though. Several years ago, my best friend and I were on a cross-country road trip to get her back to university before the semester started. Our first stop was right outside of Dallas, at this cute little house. It was an older wooden two-story with a very pointed roof, which gave it a cottage-y vibe. We walk in and immediately it feels like we're being watched, although the owner isn't there. The way to the second floor weirdly was up one of those industrial stair ladders. I'm not sure what happened to the original staircase, but this one was very similar to what my father used to have at work, so he could get things from storage. Our room was past a couple dark empty attic spaces, but was pretty spacious and had a nice big bathroom. After we made sure we weren't in danger of bumping our heads on the slanted ceiling, we checked out the in-suite and stood around talking by the shower since it was still daylight, and we liked how it came in through the little window above the sink. All of a sudden, the shower curtain pushed out, like someone punched it from the other side. It happened slightly behind my friend, and she was confused when I gasped and cut her off mid-sentence. I explained what I saw, and we fled the bathroom. After a few minutes, we collected ourselves and re-entered with our phones ready to speed dial the police in case there was an actual person hiding in the shower. I took off my shoes and chucked them over the shower curtain, but they clearly didn't hit anything and fell right to the floor. We cautiously punched at it ourselves, but didn't feel anything. When we finally pulled it back, sure enough, there was nothing there, and nowhere for an asshole to hide anywhere in the room. We even checked for vents that could have been blowing stuff around, but nothing. At that point, we just made the assumption that there was some sort of spirit and decided to go and get dinner. As we were heading back down, the watch sensation came back. but it felt different than it did upstairs. We explained that we were invited guests, that we just staying the night, and thanked whoever was there for allowing us into their home. After that, the feeling didn't necessarily dissipate, but it definitely felt less suspicious and oppressive pretty much immediately. I think there were two spirits in the house, judging from the vibe I got, but neither were assholes, really. Don't know if they were departed souls or entirely something else, but we had a pretty decent stay that night. Never met the owner though, so it wasn't brought up at all, and it might have been rude to do so anyway. The way I wrote this made it sound like bullshit, but it happened. I had diarrhea in that bathroom, and I felt more judged than normal. I know y'all don't all believe in the paranormal, which is totally fine, but the experience still creeped us out, whatever it was. Mosquitoes whined by my head like old American biplanes. I swatted them down like I was King Kong. More launched in dizzying waves. Jesus Christ, I muttered, slapping my sweat-slicked skin each time I felt the tingle of mosquito penetration. I know how wrong that sounds. Imagine how it felt. It was an August night, and northern Maine was hell. The air was thick and ripe with humidity, and the woods spewed bugs like Chernobyl's blown reactor spewed radiation. I stood in the middle of the messy field behind the quaint, Cape Cod-style Airbnb we had rented for the weekend. The grass licked at my knees, dried, yellowed. Bound on three sides by thick woods, the house at my back, trees everywhere else. During the day it was a dull, muddy view, the trees drooping and sad, the grass twisted and dead. But at night it went alive with fireflies. Thousands of the glowing bugs winked on and off, doing whatever the fireflies do. What do fireflies do? What's their purpose, I mean? Other than leaving behind a luminescent smear when mean kids squash them. I'd have to Google that later. I caught some, Daddy, my daughter Eileen declared as she waded over to me, bright with excitement over the glowing mason jar cupped protectively to her chest. The grass rose to her neck, parting as she moved through. She was only 6, small and precious, and to her these things were very important. Look at 'em dance, Eileen exclaimed, thrusting the jar up at me. Is that what fireflies did? Dance? I made an impressed face at her jar of trapped bugs. Her Firefly Prison. Was that a novel? Firefly Prison. Should be. Great title. That's great, Han, but where's Mammoth? It's time to go inside. She looked around, kind of lost. I sighed. Once I find him, it's bedtime. Fine. She huffed, bouncing off to catch more lightning bugs. As I drifted off towards the tall, scraggly, shadow-drenched forest in search of our dog, I felt a shiver ripple up my spine. It was creepy. Quiet and creepy. Mammoth, I called, hating the way my words decayed out into the trees. David Mammoth was our dog. A border collie still chugging on at the ripe age of 14, his muzzle gray, his eyes milky with cataracts. I had named him, and now I had apparently lost him. I jumped when I felt something loose and oily rub up against my leg. That was just how Mammoth felt these days. His fur was oddly slimy. He stood beside me panting, a low whine building in the back of his throat. "Where'd you go, buddy?" I asked him. His wizened old eyes looked up at me. Before he could reply, my daughter cried out. "Oh my God." I felt my neck prickle with dread. "Daddy," she squealed. I couldn't quite see her through the grass, so I chased her voice and found her squatting on her haunches, crouched over something on the ground. The jar of fireflies, the prison, was capsized in the grass beside her. The lid sprung. Paroled fireflies drifted out into freedom. "What's wrong, honey? Are you hurt?" I asked, concerned. But when she looked up at me, I saw she was smiling. "Look, Daddy." She hefted it up. I caught a shooting star. "What is it?" my wife Monica asked, puzzled. She was a tall, earthly beauty with firm features and long brown hair. Her big green eyes were fixed on the thing sitting in the middle of the dining room table. It was a 3-dimensional, 5-pointed star about the size of a frisbee. The kind of thing you'd see topping a Christmas tree. Its construction was strange. It might have been quartz crystal. But no, it was too light for quartz, only weighing about as much as a hardcover book. Its color was milky and opaque, marbled here and there with darker, earthy tones, its unblemished surface smooth, but not cold, its tips pointed but not sharp. Holding it, you could feel an almost deep vibration, a power resonating in its depths, leaching out. But that wasn't even the incredible part. "Watch this, Mom," Eileen squealed. She touched one tiny index finger to the star's center, finding the slight incline that rose up between its 5 points. Without any sound or dramatics, the star lit up a warm, reddish-brown light emanating from deep within its core. She touched the spot again, and the light extinguished. "Okay, what?" was all my wife could say, astonished, slightly concerned. "It's a shooting star, Mommy. I caught a shooting star," Eileen said in one great burst. We had been seeing them all night, ratcheting through the night sky on important galactic business. That said, I didn't know what the hell this thing was or where it had come from. My daughter claimed she had seen it hovering in the air just above the grass, said it was talking to her. Batshit crazy, right? But she was small, and I didn't want her growing up too fast, so I indulged her little fantasy. Eileen found it in the field. I said, not wanting to admit I had taken my eyes off her if only for a moment. "She found it in the field?" Monica asked, incredulous. She gave me a look I knew all too well. It said, "And where were you?" "Can I keep it?" Eileen begged. "Please, please, please." I remember what I said next in startling clarity. It was the 3-sentence catalyst that shredded through my life like an industrial combine, the great, whirring blades of a tractor that would go chewing through my family, sparing only a clumpy red mess in its wake. Monica shot me a look that said, "We are not keeping that," and I ignored it, not wanting to disappoint my daughter. "Just for the weekend, honey," I said. "But when we go home it stays here. Could be someone else left it behind, they might want it back." My daughter squealed, wrapping me in a hug before lugging her shooting star upstairs. Monica's face darkened, flushing with blood. She felt betrayed, like I had gone behind her back. And maybe I had, but what the hell? What was the big deal? The star was harmless. "I don't want that thing in the house," she hissed in my ear. "What's the harm?" I asked. "I don't." She trailed off, shook her head. "It gives me a funny feeling. In the bottom of my stomach. I don't like it." "What's wrong with it?" "You found it out in the field, Mark. And how does it glow?" "There's no battery panel, no little charging ports. How does it light up?" I sighed. "Could just be one of those tech things you see in the back of Christmas gift catalogs. There's nothing to it. They have wireless charging now." She shook her head again, but I could see she was relenting, feeling silly. She pinched the bridge of her noise, sighed, looked up at me, tired. "Where's Mammoth? I should take him out before bed." I hadn't seen him since I'd had to practically drag him inside. He had been acting strange ever since we'd found the star, whining and violently thrashing his head like the thing emitted a high-frequency hum he didn't care for. "I'm not sure. Around." When I finally did find him the next morning, curled up in the upstairs closet, he was dead, blood crusted over his old gray muzzle, running in trickles from his eyes and nose. I didn't wonder if it had any connection to the star, but of course it did. I know that now. We buried Mammoth in the back of the field, marking his grave with an oblong rock. His death had put a dampen on the vacation, but I had paid for the weekend, and despite my wife's protests, wasn't keen on leaving early. We ate dinner in silence. Eileen's star on her lap, comforting her, it seemed. After that, my wife and daughter built a pillow fort in the living room, the glow of the stars silhouetting them through sheets and blankets. Then world grew dark, and it was time for bed. I went to kiss Eileen goodnight when I heard her speaking in low tones. I paused outside her bedroom door and listened. Why would I do that? She was saying in a hoarse whisper. "I love my mom and dad." What the hell, I thought. I eased open the door and saw Eileen sitting crisscross applesauce on the end of the bed. The star was glowing and levitating head level with her. It instantly dropped to the ground. Eileen looked up at me, startled. What? Then my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The thing had been floating. What's wrong, Daddy? My daughter's voice came from a faraway place. My vision swam, pinned on the impotent star at the foot of her bed. I could almost feel my thoughts and feelings sucking toward it, like it was lassoing them out of my head. I fished for my voice. It wouldn't come. Then it did. Clear as day. It was the voice of lies, of falsehoods and wrongdoings. It was my voice, but it didn't come from my mouth. It was whispered right in my ear. It said, "Stay." I jumped and whirled around. Behind me, the upstairs hallway was empty. It was empty and dark, wrapped in shadow. Then it was flooded with warm, buttery light from Aileen's bedroom. I knew that light. Starlight. The air changed, moved around me, charged and alive. I slowly turned, knowing what I'd find. I turned and saw the star floating just before my eyes. Floating before me, smooth and awful, its light warm and blinding. Red liquid bloomed to its surface, swirling and dancing beneath the star's skin. I knew instantly it was the blood of my family. The world spun around me. Darkness crashed in on my vision. I heard my daughter say stay as I crumpled down into darkness. I awoke in bed, Monica dampening my forehead with a cool towel. What? I started. SHH, you need to rest. Eileen. She's fine. She's asleep with her star. I bolted up in bed, startling my wife back a step. Get it away from her. What? She looked surprised. It's comforting. It was flying, I snarled. Monica's eyes widened with surprise. Not used to that tone from me. I don't think having it's such a bad thing, she said, if it helps her process Mammoth's death. A cold bolt of unease shot through my chest. Last night she had been against letting Aileen keep it, but suddenly it was okay. Then I had a revelation. A slimy, awful revelation. I looked Monica in the eyes, remembering what my daughter had said. Does it talk to you? I asked. My wife's face answered for her. The color drained away. Her eyes darted away from mine, then instantly back. Does what talk to me? She lied. I stood up and brushed past her, storming up the hall and into my daughter's room. She was sound asleep, fast in the glow of the star which sat harmlessly on the bedside table. I grabbed it and breezed outside without ever waking her. I brushed the star's center, dousing its light, and frisbee tossed it as far as I could. It spun off, disappearing into the field with a muffled report. Then I went inside and crashed into the deepest sleep of my life. I awoke just before noon, a blast of late morning sunlight hammering through the windows. I groaned. My head was pounding, felt like I'd polished off 2 six-packs last night. I stumbled downstairs into the kitchen. My daughter and wife were at the kitchen table eating peanut butter sandwiches. Monica and I avoided eye contact. The air was loaded, heavy with the aftermath of our conversation last night. I grabbed a mug from the cupboard, the coffee pot. Then I saw what sat in Aileen's lap. The coffee pot shattered at my feet. The mug did a second later. My wife and daughter's heads snapped up in a bit of slapstick that would have been funny under other circumstances. But there was nothing funny about the star planted on Aileen's lap, the one I had thrown out last night. Where? I wetted my lips. Where did you get that? Where'd I get what, Daddy? She asked. Star? All I could manage. She frowned. Beside my bed. The room swam. My breath went shallow, a cold rasp in my chest. I was going to faint again. I steadied myself on the counter, looked my family in the eyes. I took a deep breath, and they shot into focus. We're leaving right now. I bolted upstairs and started packing. Monica found me in a mess of clothes. Mark, what's with you? We're leaving early, I said, throwing a jacket into my suitcase. Like you suggested. I think... She hesitated. I think we should stay a while. Another week, maybe. This is the place where Mammoth died, the dog Eileen's known all her life. She needs time to process that. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What are you saying? She looked away before summoning the nerve to meet my gaze. I extended our stay for another few days. You did what? Just until Eileen, it's no big deal. Why didn't you talk to me about this? She frowned. We did talk about it. Last night. No, we didn't, I stopped. Mind racing. Had we talked about it? Last night was a blur. A hole in my memory. I remembered tossing the star into the field. But why had I thrown it outside? I couldn't remember anything beyond that. I let out a long, uneven sigh. Slumped down on the bed. The weight of the world on my shoulders. Monica's hands found my back. Pulled me into a hug. It felt good. Warm and good. She leaned in, whispered in my ear. Stay. All at once I remembered. I remembered last night. Remembered the hovering star. Remembered the word I had heard in my own voice that wasn't my own at all. I pried loose of my wife's embrace, looked her in the eyes, and saw a dim glow flickering just behind her pupils. Starlight. A memory fought to the front of my brain. A memory of my wife and daughter sitting in that pillow fort, bathed in the star's warm, soft light. A cold blanket of fear swallowed me. I staggered to my feet. Monica's arms tried to pull me back. I wrenched free. Stay, Mark, please. I ignored her, rushed out into the dining room, my wife calling after me. Eileen was still at the dining table, her face pale, cheeks gaunt. She looked sick, like a kid from a children's hospital commercial. Stay, Daddy, my daughter groaned, her voice hoarse. Can't you stay? The star was hovering beside her and spinning at increasing velocity. It was like a hacksaw blade screaming in place, its pointed tips a blur of jagged angles. It was flickering, throbbing with light, awful, harsh light. Stay, Mark. Monica's voice in my ear. Stay with me and Eileen. But it wasn't Monica's voice at all. It was the star's voice. It was the star. Stay, Daddy, stay. Eileen, get away from it, I screamed, but it was too late. With a great flash of light, the star shot forward and tore through my daughter. That moment is a blur, a fragment, a memory shattered by my tortured mind. I remember a great wet shredding sound, like a damp log being fed through a wood chipper. My daughter didn't scream. Her ruined body hit the floor with a thud, a hot splash of guts and blood slapping the whitewashed walls as she fell. My wife brushed past me chanting, stay, stay, stay. She stood, arms out, the gore-spattered star hovering and twisting in the air before her. Monica looked like a worshiper paying tribute to her lord, intoning the same word in a flat, leveled voice. Stay, stay, stay. Then the star blasted forward. I remember my wife's death more clearly. A long, horrible frame of violence. The spinning star blew through her face, grinding through her beauty in a burst of red. Twists of brain blew out like shrapnel. A shard of her jawbone embedded itself in my cheek, just below my right eye. I didn't even feel it. Didn't feel the soft, warm rush of blood trickle down my face and into my shirt. I was rooted in place. My whole body heavy, encased in lead. My wife's lifeless body pitched forward and hit the floor with a dead thump, landing beside my ruined daughter. They were a tangle of bent limbs, a syrupy pool of blood expanding beneath them. And still I heard their voices, overlapping, chanting, a cacophony of stays in both my ears. Stay, stay, stay. The star turned on me, whirring, hovering, spinning a blur of movement. My wife and daughter's voices were getting louder. Stay, stay, stay. The star drenched in their blood spun, waiting for me to accept my fate, waiting for me to stay. The voices in my ear louder now, deafening, burrowing through my brain like small brown insects. Stay, stay, stay. I scraped the bottom of my soul, channeling my anger and pain and confusion into a roar. No, I screamed with everything I had. All at once there was silence. My wife and daughter's voices gone. The star pulsed, its light blasting out, dousing the room in crimson. Then, bam! It blew through the ceiling, disappearing into the sky. leaving behind two broken things that were the loves of my life. I collapsed over their bodies and sobbed. The next few weeks were a blur. A blur of hospital and interrogation rooms. A blur of nurses and detectives. I don't remember anything but the dull, constant ache in the center of my heart, my broken, twisted heart. The one moment I remember with any clarity is being charged with the murder of my family. As I write this, I'm currently standing trial for the deaths of my wife and daughter. No murder weapon was recovered, but detectives are convinced I must have hidden it in the vast, untouched forest sprawling the world beyond that field. What am I supposed to say? It flew off into the sky. My lawyers are fighting for an insanity plea. And maybe I am insane. After everything I've seen, I can't be sure anymore. I've thought a lot about that star, where it came from, where it went. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to. I suppose this is a cautionary tale. A warning, and if I can spare one family the agony I've gone through, I'll have succeeded. If you ever find a star in the field behind your house, or in the grass, or in the woods, leave it and run. Forget you've ever seen it. Run, and whatever you do, no matter what. I don't like to use the term skinwalker to describe the hellspawn that wander the Appalachian Mountains. I say this because the only people that believe in skinwalkers are the ones who have actually seen them. I sure as hell didn't believe in any such thing until about 2 weeks ago. The Appalachian Mountains had always been a place that I wanted to visit. The pictures on Google were enough for me. The place is beautiful. I had heard a few stories about skinwalkers roaming around the mountains during the night, which just made it all the more interesting. So I saved up some money, rented a cabin, and flew out here to experience the mountain lifestyle for a couple of weeks. The first few days were completely normal. I had gotten settled in and felt completely fine. Hiking some surrounding trails is all that I can recall for the first 3 or 4 days. It was on that 5th day that everything began going to shit. The cabin that I had rented had 2 big floodlights facing the backyard. Every night a coyote would walk past my cabin, causing the lights to turn on. I thought nothing of it. It was honestly kinda cute. On the 5th night of my stay, I was sitting in the living room watching some satellite TV. In the corner of my eye, I saw the floodlights flick on. I jumped up to go see my new coyote friend through the window. Let's just say that whatever caused my floodlights to turn on that night was not a coyote. Its body looked completely normal except for the legs. The legs were extremely long and skinny, probably 3 times longer than any normal coyote. The thing just stared at me. My fight or flight didn't kick in. All I could do was stare back into its empty eyes. This creature then let out the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard, then got even closer to the window. I turned around to grab my phone so I could call the police. As I was walking to the couch, the floodlights turned off. The soft glow of the old TV screen was the only thing lighting the living room. I grabbed my phone and sprinted upstairs to my room. My first instinct was to hide in the closet, so I did just that. The closet doors had little slits in them, so I could kinda see what was going on outside. I picked up my phone and tried to call the police. There was one slight problem, though. My phone was dead. It was around this point that I heard knocking coming from my front door. The knocking continued for what felt like an hour. I literally had no idea what to do, so I just sat there, hoping that it would stop. It eventually did stop, but shortly after, I heard the door open. No kicking the door in or anything, it just opened. I started to cry. I could hear faint footsteps getting louder and faster as it went up the stairs. It eventually got to my room, where I thought I was dead for sure. I could hear it opening drawers and messing with my bed sheets. I peered through one of the slits in the door, but I couldn't really see anything. That was until the creature put its disgusting, rotting face right up against the door. It was breathing so loudly that it was hurting my ears. I pushed myself back into a corner and used one of my jackets to cover me. It was my last option. I don't know how long I sat there, but it felt like an eternity. I eventually peeked out from behind my jacket to see some light coming through the doors. I stood up and looked out. It was daytime. I couldn't hear the creature anymore. I assumed that it got spooked by the sunlight and left. I slowly opened my closet door. It was finally safe. Needless to say, I got the F out of there, and I'm never going back. I don't want to see a therapist because they won't believe me. They'll think I'm insane. Maybe I am insane, I don't know. All I know is that whenever the locals of the Appalachian Mountains talk about these things, they aren't lying. The notification came through on the Airbnb app at around 8:30 p.m. Someone wanted to rent the apartment tonight. I swiped down the notification bar and read the first line. Mike has made a reservation. Please confirm the booking. I was already in bed, but it wasn't too late for a booking. I didn't mind renting out my place. It helped pay the bills. I clicked the notification to open the app. My phone was slow and annoying, so I kept tapping the screen where the confirm button would be as I waited for it to load. I must have tapped it on the right spot cause as soon as the app opened it said I had accepted the booking. I got up and took a shower then, changed into some old clothes before heading over to the apartment to clean it up. Mike wanted to start the booking from 10:30 p.m. Again, a little late and didn't give me much time, but it was easy money for little effort. When I reached the front door, he was standing outside with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He had short black hair and wore thick glasses that gave him a nerdy look. He looked familiar, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. His face was pale, and he seemed nervous. "Are you Mike?" I asked as I approached the apartment building. Yeah." He stepped forward and shook my hand. "I'm Sam," I said. "Sam? Is that your first name or last?" he asked. "First," I replied. "All right. Well, nice to meet you. First name is Sam." What a weird thing to say, I thought. But he seemed like a quirky guy, so I thought nothing more of it. I opened the main door and motioned for Mike to come in. "You're not going to need anything else out here, right?" I asked him. "No, I've got all I need now, thanks," he replied. Another odd thing to say, but whatever, I thought, and closed the door behind us. We headed down the corridor to my apartment. "So what brings you here tonight?" I asked him. "Tonight?" He seemed puzzled. "Yeah, I mean you booked quite late." "I did, didn't I?" "Yeah, I had another place booked, but they canceled last minute," he explained. "Oh, okay then," I said, a little confused. He seemed a bit spaced out, but he'd paid up front, so I figured he was legit. I stopped outside my apartment. "Well, this is the place if you still want to stay," I announced. He didn't respond. I put my key in the lock and opened the door. "Please take your shoes off and leave them by the front door." He didn't say anything, but took his shoes like I asked while I slipped off my trainers and put on my slippers. I couldn't help but notice he was staring at my feet the whole time. It made me feel a bit uncomfortable, but as soon as he noticed I had noticed him staring, he looked away. "Follow me," I said once I had my slippers on. We walked into the living room, and he sat down on the sofa and immediately started fiddling with his phone. "So you're only staying for the night, right?" I asked him, trying to get him to engage with me. "Yep," he said without looking away from his phone. "What about food?" "I'll grab something later," he replied again, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Okay, well, let's go ahead and get you set up with keys then," I said. I went over to the kitchen cupboard, grabbed a set of keys, and handed it to Mike. He slipped it into his pocket and went back to tapping on his phone. "So you don't have any luggage or anything?" I asked him. "No, no baggage," he replied with a grin on his face. "Okay, well, let me give you the tour." I showed him around the apartment, but he only seemed interested in the kitchen. He was opening cupboards and drawers and even wiped a small stain on the counter with the sponge. He was a bit OCD, I thought. We headed back to the living room, and he sat back on the sofa. "So what do you think?" I asked him. Sure, all good, yeah," he replied back, staring at his phone. "Okay then," I said, and forced a smile before turning to head back into the living room. It was odd, but I didn't have to stick around and look after him. I had done my bit, so it was time to go. "I'm gonna leave you to it. Any problems, my number is on the fridge," I told him, pointing towards the kitchen. "Yeah, sure," he replied, still not taking his eyes off his phone. I turned and walked out into the corridor and stopped by the front door to put my shoes back on. I took off my slippers and started putting my trainers on. I about had one trainer on when I could have sworn I heard the sound of a camera shutter. I looked towards the living room to see Mike look away and start tapping on his phone again. I couldn't be sure, but I felt like he was taking a picture of me. I decided not to make things awkward and accuse him of anything and left. I felt a bit uncomfortable leaving him alone in the apartment, but it was only one night after all. I got home at about 11:30. I put my letters down, made a cup of tea, and curled up on the bed with my laptop. I browsed the internet and checked my inboxes. Airbnb had sent an email confirming Mike's payment had cleared. I guess I was worried about nothing after all. I fell asleep shortly after that. The alarm on my phone went off at 6:43 a.m. Surprisingly, I felt well rested and peaceful. I unlocked my phone and looked at my notifications. A few spammy emails, a WhatsApp message from my mom wishing me good morning. I swear that woman never sleeps. And a DM on Airbnb from Mike received at 6:06. The message read, "Hey, sorry I didn't turn up last night. Met up with a few mates and ended up crashing on the sofa at one of theirs. Don't worry, I've still paid for the booking and will leave you a 5* review. Cheers, Mike." Wait, what? I was puzzled. I reread the message several times before I replied. "Hey man, do you mean you went out with friends after I left and didn't end up coming back? If so, that's cool as long as you locked up the apartment and left the key." My heart and my mind were both starting to race. I had to tell myself to chill. Mike probably just got drunk and forgot about meeting me earlier at the apartment. A few minutes later, he replied, "No, I never even ended up coming to your town. I missed my train and by coincidence bumped into a few friends at the station, and we went for a few drinks. Not sure what you mean by after I left. Anyway, all the best, mate." Now my heart was racing. If this guy hadn't stayed in my apartment last night, then who the hell had? Then as I stood there staring at the screen, I noticed Mike's profile picture. I clicked on it to enlarge it. It was not the guy from last night. This guy was blonde and built like an NFL player. I grabbed my keys and ran out to my car to drive over to the apartment. My heart and mind were racing now. What if he'd robbed the place? Or even worse, what if he'd robbed and wrecked the place? I couldn't stop thinking how stupid I was to not check his photo or ask him for his ID. When I got to my apartment, there were crowds of people outside, police and an ambulance. I could feel it had something to do with my apartment. I parked my car, jumped out, and pushed my way to the building entrance, where police were blocking the door. "Excuse me," I shouted, trying to push through them. One of the officers put his hand on my chest to stop me and said, "Can't let anyone in, madam." "But I own one of the apartments. We're conducting an investigation, madam," he replied. "Investigation?" I asked, confused. "Yes, someone attacked a young woman inside one of the apartments last night." I froze. "What happened?" I gasped. "Sorry, I can't tell you anything more." I felt sick. What if it was that guy? "Do you have any idea who was involved?" I asked, praying it wasn't the guy I let in last night. "Look, if you want to help, keep your eyes open for a nerdy-looking, pale-skinned guy with thick glasses. A few residents say they saw him hanging around outside, and one other said they saw him leaving around 1 a.m. My heart stopped and sank. "Oh my God, it's him," I blurted out. "Where?" The policeman spluttered, looking around. "No, I mean that's the man I let stay in my apartment last night, the same man you just described. I thought he was here to rent my Airbnb, but I didn't check his picture or ID before letting him. I just assumed he was the guy." "What apartment is yours?" the officer asked. 6.66 inches, I stuttered. "Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but that's the apartment the young woman was killed in." "Killed?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Did you speak to him at all?" The police officer pulled out his notepad and began to scribble things down. "Yes, I introduced myself to him, and he said his name was Mike." "Mike, you say?" repeated the officer. "Yes." "And your name is madam?" he asked. "Sam," I answered. But Mike was the name of the guy who had actually made the booking and didn't turn up. "Okay, you're gonna have to start from the beginning, Sam, 'cause I'm a little confused," said the officer. I told him about my Airbnb and how the real Mike had messaged me that morning apologizing for not turning up. "Right, that is quite the mix-up, Sam. If you ask me, you're lucky to be alive." At that moment, the building doors swung open, and the paramedics wheeled out a body covered by a white sheet. Seeing it triggered the realization that could be me under there, and I burst into tears. "I'm so sorry," I sobbed. The officer patted me on the shoulder. "Hey, it's not your fault, Sam. You couldn't have known this would happen." Another officer came over. They exchanged a few hushed words until finally, the second officer left with the rest of the police. "Okay, Sam, you'll have to stay elsewhere for a few nights, but you can get anything you need from the apartment now. Okay, I have another house where I live. This is my Airbnb apartment, but there are a few bits I'd like to grab. Let's head up." The officer motioned for me to lead the way, and we went into the building and up to my apartment. When I opened the apartment door, I expected to see a bloodbath, but no, everything looked normal. I went into the living room, and it was immaculate. You got lucky, the victim was attacked in the kitchen, so the cleanup team was able to erase pretty much all traces of the incident. "If it had been in here on your carpet, it would have been a different matter," the officer explained. "Yeah, that is. Lucky, I guess." I tried to see the positive side of all this, but was still shaken up about the whole thing. What exactly did he do to her? The girl was visiting another resident and had left the apartment to go home when the killer dragged her into your apartment and choked her to death. "Oh my God, that's awful," I exclaimed. "That's not even the worst bit. The sicko cut all her toes off, and they weren't able to find them anywhere. Forensics reckon he took them with him, some kind of trophy." The officer had a sickened look on his face like he had a bad smell under his nose. "You're right, that is sick. Is it okay if I look around to see if anything is missing?" "Sure, go ahead. Try not to touch or move things in the kitchen." I nodded and began looking around the apartment. I didn't have many things there. A few spare clothes, some old photos, a toothbrush, and some letters I'd forgotten to take with me from the last time I was there. I picked up the letters and went back to the living room. "Well, everything looks pretty normal. Nothing seems to be missing." "Okay, well, if you're about done, I'm gonna have to ask you to lock up and head out. Here are the station details and my name. I'm Officer Doyle. You can ask for me if you have any questions. We'll be in contact again when we've finished our full investigation." "Okay, thank you, that's great. Do you have any idea how long it might be till I can have the apartment back again?" I asked. "It's likely to be about a week. That said, I've got a feeling nobody is going to be rushing to book your apartment anytime soon." The officer chuckled. He was way too upbeat for my liking and a little insensitive, to be honest. I guess he's used to this sort of thing, or maybe that's just how he dealt with things. I turned around and made my way back to the front door, with the officer behind me. I was about to reach for the door handle when I noticed it. Oh my God, he stole my slippers. Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.